For better or worse, ladies and gentlemen, Chris's extremely troubled and disturbed life is something that should be taken as something of a bit of a case study, not only by people who just so happen to be talking trash about him on the internet, but also by people who know Chris maybe a bit more personally, that you know the sort of things that Chris has been through, and also the things that not only we know about, but also a lot of the things that even the most passive of passive observers don't even know about. For all we know, the iceberg might have branched off into other little miniature icebergs that perhaps even we don't even know about, and probably we'll go on for the rest of our lives not knowing about. And to be honest, I'm kind of glad for this, because it's sort of not really our place to know every single nook and cranny about a person's life with that level of detail, to say the least. I know there are people out there who are that obsessed about it, but I know there will also be plenty of people who will do what it takes to basically milk anything out of Chris's loins until the day he finally ends. Anyway, what was I just describing myself there? No, I hope not. But with that being said, one thing you're going to be hearing of a lot in sort of Chris's history is, outside of the trolling sagas, there's a fair degree of using Chris to another person's advantage, manipulation, which is, ironically enough, the subject for today's video. So this is, first we get an extract from Marvin, otherwise known as the man in the pickle suit. For every trolling saga, there was a bunch of stuff happening in the background. Chris's reactions on YouTube were highly inflated by troll girlfriends whispering to him behind the scenes. "Oh Chris, you're not just gonna take that, are you? Chris, I need a man who could stand up for himself, not just a little wuss. It takes quite a bit to whip Chris up into a frenzy, and it's hard to keep it going." Yeah, this is like Casey and Jackie was sort of like really the last ones to really do this. Also from Marvin, something like 90% of what got Chris to make the videos he did was never made public. Well, yeah, Chris is always been sort of pronounced profoundly lazy, but again, this is just like the stuff we know of. It may not be every detail, but yeah. Manipulation is a psychological tactic aimed at taking advantage of someone in order for them to perform a specific action. This has been a key technique used by Chris's trolls, his enablers, and his own mother. Behind the scenes of trolling. Trolling is necessary for Chris to be as funny as everyone expects him to be. People don't like to hear this because they want to believe Chris is a crazy free-ring circus of fun, 24/7. But he's really not. He's got his moments, but he's a phenomenon that needs to be curated if you want to experience the old school trolling days. To be fair, I can't really see like anybody really wanting that stuff to come back, because even in the old school trolling days, you still had psychopaths like Blue Spike. I don't really know if Blue Spike ever went to jail for, or faced any sort of troubles for what he did, but that kid was like messed up beyond, and he's only about like 2 years older than me. One of Chris's former trolls, the man in the pickle suit, has often posted on Kiwi Farms describing how trolls manipulated Chris behind the scenes. Hundreds of hours worth of calls between Chris and the trolls took place, much of it never released. Information was also omitted on the Quickie, with several trolls were members of to paint a funnier picture of Chris, a side effect of which has created a skewed impression of him to fans. Trolls would intentionally obscure their true identities even from each other, and many would even change core details to further confuse those seek to dox them. Yeah, exactly. It's done literally for data protection. That's exactly what they did it for. For example, Clyde Cash was originally meant to be a plain but successful Asian American guy, but this image was later replaced with a Guido stereotype, and everyone went along with it. In the background calls, people would plant ideas in Chris's head and goad him into making videos. One such example is the twin falling towers. Yeah, I wish I could say that. I don't even really want to put that on because that video is like so infamous, and well, it's just the sort of thing that you really shouldn't see because it's. Anyway, it's basic, but we'll describe it anyway. A 2009 video in which Chris invoked the 9/11 tragedy to diss Clyde Cash. The man in the pickle suit described how the trolls talked to Chris behind the scenes to get him to make the video, such as, "Be sure to mention that you think he's weak. Call him weak, like some big disaster, like a bridge collapse. Oh, or compare him to 9/11. That'll embarrass him." Now, with that being said, why Chris never thought to himself in any capacity why he would even be goaded to... I mean, goading somebody is not really the same as being pressured into doing something, but why didn't Chris at any point sit back and probably think to himself, hang on a second, why would I do this? This whole squabble seems like... Does Clyde Cash even watch the videos where I call him weak? So how would it even embarrass him? And I wonder if Chris ever caught on the idea that because Clyde Cash didn't respond to anything that Chris was putting out about these videos, I wonder if Chris should have caught on to the fact that Clyde not having a response was quite it should have raised like alarm bells, but I guess not. For a decade or so, people assumed he came up with the 9/11 video of his own volition, painting an image of an unpatriotic ingrate. It didn't help that his apology video involved photoshopping the Twin Towers into candles, basically depicting the buildings as being on fire. Whether this apology video was staged or not is unknown. Later, Casey's father brought up the video in the infamous father call, claiming that he had to dig his mother out of the tower's remains. Other examples include Quick calls out 3 naive YouTubers, a set of videos in which Chris lambasted fan Sonichu is cool, trolls that planted the idea in his head that she was secretly a troll, the Quixocle video in which he jammed his dick into the snow, and the Liquid Chris saga. Chris originally didn't want to react to Liquid, but the trolls forced his hand with artificial reasons. Trolls also exploited their knowledge of Chris's psychology to goad him into get angry at his videos. Chris usually reacts to a specific stimulus and has a short memory about those sorts of things, like a goldfish. So in any video where Chris is specifically trying to act like Johnny Bravo, that was almost always in response to a request by us no more than 24 hours old. He would hype up Chris about how he's being called a pussy, and how if he doesn't make a video soon, he'll lose the rights to Sonichu. And of course, because of what we know, Chris at no point ever really called out their bluff. At least in the early days. Actually, a little bit later on, but mostly in the early days. The difference in style between videos produced by trolls and videos Chris records of his own initiative supports this point. Troll-produced videos tend to be short, succinct, and feature Chris making a fool out of himself. This also includes Chris trying to say sorry to somebody, and shows that Chris, despite all his might and resistance, he still can't even do that. Chris recording on his own tendencies tends to bore his audience by rambling about his own interests like toys or his fantasy world. The Truman Show. Chris's situation with the trolls has been compared to The Truman Show, a fictional film in which the main character is unaware he is living in a reality TV show, surrounded by impromptu actors, hidden cameras, and a conspiracy to hide the reality of a controlled environment. Chris's situation reflects Truman's, as he has been manipulated by trolls for the sole purpose of making him into a spectacle for online mockery, and many of his ostensibly private interactions have been unwittingly shared with the world. The only real difference is that Chris installed the cameras himself. Similar to how actors populate Truman's world while posing as trusted loved ones, undercover trolls posed as Chris's friends for years. They controlled access to Chris. When one sweetheart saga ended, another potential sweetheart would contact Chris and he would ask his friends to vet them. The undercover trolls would confirm to Chris that the sweetheart could be trusted, thus continuing the cycle of trolling. And considering again, as long as they were female, that was more than enough for Chris, and well, there you go. Curiously enough, Chris's standards when it comes to women seems to have been curiously shelved in moments like these, and I wonder if it's because Chris caught on that, beggars can't be choosers, and being that demanding and unreasonable is not exactly a desirable trait. It might have been the only real time unconsciously Chris had to succumb to the fact that he was not perfect and he was obviously not God's gift to women. Moving on. One such undercover troll is Phaeton, the woman behind Emily, Kim Wilson, and several other undisclosed personas. She lives locally to Chris, and she has met him in real life where she has gained his trust. Due to the severity of Chris's autism-related facial blindness, he was unable to recognize her face whenever she would meet him in town. She then exploited this weakness to trick Chris into believing he has multiple gal pals he can trust, when, in reality, all are played by a single undercover troll. Boiling Frog Fable. In the years post-2011, Chris has become increasingly vulnerable to the concept of creeping normality, often represented through the fable of the boiling frog, which states that by slowly heating a pot of water with a frog inside to a boil, the frog will not recognize itself being cooked alive, as opposed to immediately tossing itself out of the boiling water, in which case it would quickly jump out. In a manner similar to the boiling frog, Chris is increasingly unable to recognize when he is the target of manipulation without being told outright by others that said manipulation has taken place. In 2018, the Idea Guys manipulated Chris in ways darker than had ever been attempted before, including systematically dismantling his imaginary world and its cast of characters, engaging in criminal extortion against him, and accusing Chris of, well, the P word, if he didn't play along with them. See overview section. Chris was also gaslit to the point of completely believing everything the Idea Guys said to him. While the efforts of the guard dogs minimally restored Chris's self-awareness to the point that he will level angry asides at the Idea Guys for their extortion in his videos, as demonstrated in those during the Soft Exile saga, Chris still wholeheartedly believes in modifications the Idea Guys made to both the Solitude canon and real-world aspects of Chris's life. He appears from the outside to be no longer able to discern this new normal from which it came before it, thus being affected by creeping normality. Then again, calling normality in relation to Chris seems a little bit strange, because Chris has the capabilities of trying to be presented as normal, but a lot of people have also attributed this to some sort of bizarre level of like brain disease that was causing Chris's mind to deteriorate in ways that not even the Idea Guys can anticipate. That's probably nowhere near true, but it might possibly give some explanation as to why Chris pulls sorts of faces as though he's about to have a stroke. Social engineering. Chris believes in crazy TV hacker stereotypes. That's why we always so easily told him we hacked into his phone or his email and blamed all our leaks on that. Our various troll girlfriends got away scot-free. From Marvin. Trolls exploit Chris's naive nature to gain access to his accounts. In order to leak emails or videos. After gaining Chris's trust via an internet persona, they would ask for access to Chris's accounts and blame the resulting trolling on hackers. Chris would then change his password while simply handing the e-girlfriend/Solitude character the new one, since he still trusted them. I don't even care if even I had a girlfriend. I would not be giving them that information. No, just don't do stuff like that. This practice came to a farcical head during the TT Squad saga, when the Squad and Guard Dog factions engaged in a tug-of-war over Chris. The Squad would log into Chris's accounts and post information from Magi-chan about the dimensional merge, and the Guard Dogs, also having Chris's passwords, countered with their own information, trying to lead Chris away from thinking about the merge. This conflict caused confusion in Chris, who wanted to trust both sides. But what if the Guard Dogs openly told Chris not to trust them, after the things that Chris did tell them from... Well, we'll get to that when we talk about those guys proper. There's a lot of things to discuss with that. Blocking help. Marvin explained how the miscreants groups of trolls had isolated Chris from help. White Knights was subverted, their messages blocked, deleted before Chris could see them. If they got through, trolls would leak their conversations with Chris and accuse the helper of being the culprit. Trolls had a vice-like grip on Chris's, and that only loosened when they willingly gave up when Bob had died. But even if the conversation of who is or isn't a troll comes up with Chris, he's still not playing on level ground. Someone accuses Julie of being a troll. Julie says that she's not a troll. Who would Chris pick? What if it's 2 people saying Julie's not a troll? 3? 4? Some of Chris's IRL friends saying that she's not a troll? Almost every person in his life. When people try to help Chris, he's not knowledgeable, throwing that help away. He cannot identify help. And by the way, for anyone asking, no, this is not the same as like criticism, but especially when it comes to art, Chris can't identify criticism either. Well, actually, I would say Chris can identify criticism, but he just chooses to ignore it. Help, however, is something that Chris actually has to ask for. It's, unless, of course, well, somebody clearly saw that Chris was, like, not able to put 1 and 1 together. There's a plateau with 20 different options, and one of those options is help. The rest are people trying to screw him over. The numbers are not in Chris's favour. Chris in between the trolling. Without stimuli like the trolls goading him to get angry, Chris just kind of fell back into his natural state, being a man-child, playing with toys, and wanting his heart sweet to take care of him. From Marvin. Since his discovery by the internet in 2007, there have been times where activity fell to the point that Chris was temporarily without manipulation from trolls or enablers. Left to his own devices, Chris would drop off the internet and concentrate on the real world instead. We held him online. If someone's not actively compelling Chris to do stupid stuff, he slides off. An example of this can be seen in Chris's internet activity following his father's death. At that point, the classic troll cabal voluntarily relinquished their control over Chris to allow him to grieve. As a direct result, Chris stopped recording wacky videos online, hence the abrupt end of the Calling Out saga. The troll experience has left Chris with lingering suspicion and paranoia as to the motives of others, and he has occasionally posted on social media channels about how he suspects people offline of being trolls, albeit without any real evidence. Chris gradually socialized in the real world again, such as hanging out at the Impulse Gay Social Club and with his Pokemon League friends. Although this respite was interspersed with the beginning of modern trolls such as Catherine and the Lady Managers, who, again, manipulated Chris back into his Truman Show existence. The business, financial crisis, and idea guy sagas were a paradigm shift from Chris's tendency to slide offline without troll influence to a new Chris, increasingly online by his own volition. Then there's the case of Chris's mother. Bob is often blamed for being Chris's original and the most persistent enabler, and it is likely that her coddling gave Chris his puerile and egocentric attitude. She is also deemed by Christorians to be the one responsible for Chris constantly taking orders from random strangers, without giving it a second thought. In the past, some of Bob's attempts at controlling Chris were nothing short of outright emotional abuse. Examples include threatening to lock Chris out of the house and leave him homeless if he dared travel further than a few miles out of town after the Ohio trip, as well as feigning cardiac arrest to bring Chris into line, terrifying him to the point of calling 911 on several occasions. Anybody ever tried to pull that stuff on me, ladies and gentlemen, I'll just say, well, don't worry, I've made sure to disconnect the phones and all that, so good luck trying to get help if you really are serious about that. Don't worry, I know fine well your phone's in your pocket, so you should be okay. Have a nice time. Yeah, don't hang around for people who do that sort of thing, ladies and gentlemen, because goodness knows what happens if they would have a very serious accident and there was nobody around to help. Perhaps the most notable incident involving this sort of manipulation took place in 2011. Chris had planned to visit that year's MagFest convention, but realized that he didn't have enough dosh left to afford a hotel room, so he instead opted to sleep in his car. After informing his parents of his plans, Bob gaslit him into backpedaling, firstly by claiming that he could be at the risk from a combination of criminals and cold temperatures, then by, again, threatening to leave him homeless, and finally by implying that she would this if Chris went to the convention. A distraught Chris cancelled his plans and received only further guilt tripping and a video game as consolation. Like I said before, you know what? Get as far away from that place as you can. Get so far away from people who do that sort of thing. They don't change just because you've fallen into line. It only reaffirms that your hold over them is that strong, and it means they'll get away with it time and time again. So don't do that, and don't put up for that kind of stuff for a moment. Manipulation techniques. As shown above, after gaining Chris's trust, it isn't particularly difficult to get him to do many things he wouldn't normally do. There is a 3-step process that most trolls and enablers use. 1. Appeasement. Give Chris an offer for something he'd really want or feed into Chris's beliefs. 2. Instructions. Provide Chris with over-the-top steps he can take to take the offer, or so that he can roleplay with you. 3. Betrayal. Watch him do it and betray him. Then watch the result of said betrayal. Rinse, dry, and repeat. As an example, Chris's history of being manipulated began with him being tricked into crawling into a tight space by childhood friend Sarah Hammer, when she told him that she found Casper the Friendly Ghost there. Sarah simply noticed that Chris had a fascination with cartoon characters being real, and knew this was the perfect opportunity to give Chris the offer to meeting him in person. Appeasement. She then told him that he would see Casper if he crawled into the hole. Instructions. And finally she locked him in, and began watching the events that would unfold. Betrayal. Kind of sinister as well for how old was, like 5 years old or something like that? Yeah. During the classic era, this technique would be used by many trolls such as Blanca Weiss, Clyde Cash, Liquid Chris, and even a bunch of trolls posing as Nintendo staff. In the case of Blanca, the trolls behind these pseudonyms simply realized that Chris really wanted a significant other to complete his love quest, and finally get some china. So they used Chris's desperate pleas to complete this mission to obtain his medallions, appeasement. Afterwards, they insisted that Chris give them the medallion if he wanted Blanca for himself, instructions, and finally they destroyed the medallion in many ways, from cutting it with a knife and hitting it with a hammer to setting it on fire and submerging the broken pieces into a jar of pickles. Betrayal. The most illegal and life-changing use of this technique to date is from Chris's most infamous enablers, the Idea Guys. After a long string of supernatural beliefs and creepy behaviours being displayed from Chris during his comeback, a troll by the name of Joshua Wise noticed his complete lack of self-awareness and wanted to see how deep the rabbit hole would go. Wise would then appeal to many of Chris's fantasies by role-playing as several of his characters, appeasement. Afterwards, he tasked him to do a number of nonsensical things, such as having him lick a drawing of Magic-chan's dick on a wall, and having him destroy a Christmas tree, telling him it was of Nazi merchandise. Instructions. And the betrayal part of this would come from the proposed humiliation that Chris would subject himself to. Even after he was doxxed and shut down for a while, along with several others, would use this technique repeatedly until they went as far as extorting large sums of money from him and falsely reporting to the FBI for being a P-word, among other things. Betrayal. A less common means that people have found to manipulate him is through this same process but in reverse. This method is a favourite among his mother. 1. Threats. Tell Chris that if he does or does not do something, you will do something undesirable that will happen to him. 2. Instructions. Tell him that, in order to prevent the undesirable thing from happening, he has to cancel all plans and instead take part of someone else's whims. 3. Betrayal/reward. Reward him for doing what he has been told to do to further strengthen his trust for you. Or you can just betray him anyway, rinse, dry, and repeat. Disclaimer, don't actually do any of these sorts of things, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a good look. Validation. Some manipulation involves giving Chris validation over his pre-existing feelings and beliefs, which influences him further. Examples include the unknown enabler who told him to get in touch with his feminine side and influenced him into identifying as a tomgirl. The subliminal frequency hypnosis videos and the people who commented in them who influenced Chris into believing his taint was transforming into the V-word, and the idea guys who exploited his beliefs about alternate dimensions in order to influence and shape those beliefs further, culminating in Chris's pseudo-religious belief over the dimensional merge. But what reasons to why Chris is so gullible? Mental deficiencies. A common aspect of autism spectrum conditions is an increased level of gullibility. Those on the spectrum are often more openly trusting of others, willing to put aside suspicion to follow what someone says, even in situations which could put them at risk. Chris also appears to have some degree of both facial blindness and difficulty recognizing voices, which are also common, though not universal, autism symptoms. Chris has been fooled by numerous personas operated by the same person. An example of this is Chris wholeheartedly believing that the person behind Jack Thaddeus in the Calling Out saga to be Ahuvia Horel, even though the two neither sounded nor looked alike, as well as Chris believing Kim Wilson to be a different person from Emily, even though the latter presented herself to Chris as the former on several occasions. Maybe Chris just wasn't listening. Even in face-to-face meetings where Chris should have been able to tell the difference, had he not been experiencing this impaired recognition. Furthermore, Julie was a 13-year-old boy using an obvious falsetto voice, yet Chris believed her to sound 100% female, even when the actor forgot to mask his voice. Enablers and lack of independence. Chris isn't very independent. He relies on the government and his mother to pay the bills, and still ends up in debt anyway. While he has made real-life friends in the past, the Idea Guys saga led him to alienate them in mid-2018. Nowadays, he prefers to surround himself with online enablers who play into his every escapist fantasy, in turn gaining his trust. Chris's dependence on other people, especially his enablers, has actually made him more susceptible to being manipulated, as all of his trust is simply put into them without any second thoughts. He is also highly susceptible to peer pressure and fitting in with others' opinions. Chris's gullible, overly trusting nature and desire for contact means that he has often been drawn to consider others as friends, even if they're acquaintances at best or simply attempting to get close for malicious reasons at worst. Even though he would often curse and even wish death upon the trolls, in recorded voice chats with them he would often appear to be quite receptive and active in such conversations, as long as the others did not cross the hurtful truth level, in which case he would become hostile in return. From an outside perspective, however, Chris's isolation has also resulted in him making him vulnerable to manipulation techniques as a result of his attempts at seeking out people beyond the horde-choked halls of 14 Branchling Court. Lack of self-awareness. Chris lacks self-awareness and a sense of boundaries. Whether for himself or for others, he has no filter, a trait which he calls honesty. He will tell you embarrassing private matters when you first meet him, including his former virginity, his story about how pink eye gave him differently coloured eyes, and even his tendency to soil himself. Once someone gains his trust, he will reveal even more personal information, most of which an average person wouldn't even reveal to a psychologist. Trolls collate the information and leak it to the general public, where it ends up on the forums, YouTube videos, and this very fine wiki. This lack of self-awareness may also be another symptom of his autism. Usually, this manifests as generally innocuous things, like being unable to regulate the volume of one's voice to match the social setting, or being unable to recognize non-verbal social cues when communicating with other people. In more severe cases like Chris, however, his lack of social awareness can come across as tone-deaf at best, or a threat to one's safety at worst. Normally, this lack of self-awareness in a social sense can be minimalized or outright cured with the proper resources, e.g. special education and the right therapist. But we all know how well that turned out. Yes, Chris, even in the last video I did, it seemed as if Chris was more concerned about, saying mainstreaming because it worked out for me, when really Chris needed much more attention. His self-entitlement. Another massive flaw that makes Chris easy to manipulate is his egotism and resulting entitlement. So long as he takes a procedure or simply whines about it long enough, many of the cases where he has been manipulated involve the manipulator noticing this fundamental character flaw and therefore bribing him with gifts and promises of self-fulfillment. The bribes could be anything from promises of romance to a video game publishing deal. As long as it's something Chris wants, trolls will use it as bait. However, this also has a tendency to backfire, as Chris always believes he is entitled to more, and will take a gift and then turn around and ask for another. General short-sightedness. And finally, Chris repeatedly falls victim to the super straight effect, where someone will provide a quick rebuttal to a point and lose ground to the wider argument. In Super Straight's case, they inadvertently corroborated the claims that trans women are women by creating a separate sexuality than straight for those who aren't attracted to them. Likewise, Chris will regularly talk himself into various corners by agreeing to various outlandish claims merely because he was pressured to accept certain points as fact to continue the conversation. This is how you get him to finally admit Liquid's true and honest name is Chris and not Jeff, then Chris Chandler, then Christian Weston Chandler. But he was given that name and not renamed by an animatronic bear, and so on theoretically forever. Though I suppose the only other really only thing I can sort of like add to this, I suppose, is the fact that a lot of Chris's activity seems to be more revolved around what's going on like in closed doors, because even presently Chris seems to be spending more and more time away from social media and more time with his sort of gal pal in Finland called Flutter. What actually goes on behind closed doors at this point, it's not particularly known, but I think, well, depending on how that ends, we'll hear it from the horse's mouth sooner or later. Because I don't really think I don't exact. Nobody really knows what the deal with Flutter really is, but whatever it is, it appears that it's sort of had a bit of an effect on Chris, considering Chris isn't chronically online to spout or to even... Well, he is sort of online in ways, but we'll get to those in different videos. So I hope all of you guys enjoy this article, ladies and gentlemen, on Chris and manipulation, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. So take care, and bye-bye for now.